Hi there and welcome to the Explaining History videocast, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about the idea of historical memory. This is something that's become much more important in academic circles in the last perhaps 10 to 15 years. It's become a far more acknowledged and fashionable, I hate to use that word, but fashionable area of thinking about history. It incorporates areas of cultural history and social history, and it is also incorporates areas of what you would call contemporary history, looking almost at the history of very immediate times. Historical memory is a fascinating thing because it is a way of looking at how different societies and different cultures remember similar events. A very obvious one would be the First World War. We're living in the centenary years of the First World War, and the war is stirring memories across the world. Dominant ways of thinking about the war here in Britain revolve around Remembrance Day, the cenotaph, the use of poppies, and the Royal British Legion, to name but a few kind of totemic and important aspects of cultural memory. And when I say cultural memory, what I mean there is that we as a culture, as a society, have a shared sense of meaning, a shared sense of collective memory, and a shared agreement on what the past means. Obviously in Germany and Austria and the other central powers, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, though obviously that ceased to exist in 1923, the former states of the Ottoman Empire, the memory of the First World War is really quite different. Two great books that came out last year and the year before, Ring of Steel by Alexander Watson and The Long Shadow by David Reynolds, are really very important ways of thinking about how the memory of the First World War was really very different in Germany. The memory of the First World War, again, in America has an entirely different meaning. The First World War in America is sandwiched by two much more important conflicts as far as the United States goes: the American Civil War, 1861 to 65, and World War II. Both conflicts have a far more lasting impact on the USA, both negative and positive, and both have a far greater impact in terms of lives lost. And in some ways, the easier the explanation for the war, i.e., the American Civil War is about slavery. It's if you wanted to summarise that one in a hurry, there you go. And the Second World War is about the defeat of Nazism, the defeat of Japanese imperialism, and to some extent Italian fascism. For America, for much of the 20th century, getting to grips as to why America was involved in the First World War in the first place is really a much more difficult and fraught affair, and that's why the First World War has a much more ambiguous and a much less coherent place within American cultural memory. Historical memory is is generated within societies by a conscious process of the production of memory. So governments collaborate in it, governments that create national war memorials, days of remembrance, governments that choose to focus on certain aspects of certain wars or certain conflicts or tragedies or disasters or what have you, and choose not to focus on other areas. The culture that develops within countries from time to time, producers of culture, filmmakers, authors, TV producers, choose and select to produce certain documentaries, books, films, and that kind of thing. But very often, the decisions to make something like, say, Schindler's List or The World at War or to write a book on the Russian Revolution, or, pick your favourite. Those decisions are often less important than the response of the audience. At certain times, a filmmaker like Steven Spielberg can perhaps tap into latent feelings about the Holocaust, or can introduce the Holocaust to a new generation of people who have perhaps not really explored it as a phenomenon in the past. And historical memory I believe, is created by the interplay between governments, between the creators of cultural art, cultural meaning, such as filmmakers and novelists and writers and dramatists, and the population at large, who either do want to engage with these sort of historical events or don't. There's an enormous process of selection. The commemoration of certain atrocities, things like such as the Holocaust, are in some ways based on realpolitik. It is possible to commemorate the Holocaust currently. Try commemorating the 45 million who died under Mao's Great Famine at the time when the government is trying to put on a state visit from China. Entirely different proposition. The commemoration of the Holodomor, the Stalinist famine in the Ukraine, has gathered a lot of strength in countries where there's a large Ukrainian diaspora, places like Canada and Australia. But as far as it goes in Britain at the moment, even though there are very sour relations with Vladimir Putin, there's been no such attempt to really raise the Holodomor to the kind of the level of the Holocaust. And there's an awful lot of very angry debate between Ukrainian Holodomor victims and survivors and families, and those that want to retain a certain level of exclusivity in suffering and in historical memory for the Holocaust. But that's a whole other debate that will probably take half a dozen podcasts to explore. So historical memory is a kind of part of what historians do. It's part of what history students do. It's part of what the public does. It is the present day creation of meaning, and historical meaning and historical memory is fluid. We no doubt will not remember the First World War in 20 or 30 years' time as we remember it now, just as 20 or 30 years ago we remembered it in very different ways. And part of that is to do with who's alive to do the remembering. Whether we're talking about the Harry Patch, for example, the last veteran is now gone a couple of years ago, and we have now even the children of those veterans are incredibly elderly. The grandchildren of those veterans are incredibly elderly. A great-grandchild of someone who died in the First World War, have just been blessed with the great-grandchild of a veteran of the First World War recently. So it's very much a generational thing, and a generation in 20 or 30 years' time might be faced with a conflict that has resonance with the First World War. Here's hoping not, but we're now entering a period of conflict in the Middle East, which will have obvious parallels, perhaps some interesting parallels, next year with the beginning of the Arab Revolt of 1916, the centenary thereof. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this and found this little ramble interesting, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History videocast.